Yes, ready. Okay, maybe we can begin now if Professor Tomlinson is ready.
Yeah.
And if you think we can begin, we have more people to arrive, but maybe we can begin and people can arrive later.
Okay.
Yes. Okay, very well. So now, again, good morning, everyone. We are beginning our second day at the second EMDELIC, seminário sobre elaboração de material didático para o ensino de inglês para crianças. And today we are going to begin our first conference, and we are receiving Professor Brian Tomlinson. Professor Brian Tomlinson from Anaheim University and the University of Liverpool, author of several works in the area of language teaching materials design, works that have influenced a lot the area. Professor Tomlinson has large experience in the designing of teaching materials, not only in the development of research, but also in language teaching material policies, which have helped to consolidate the field. It's a great honor to have Professor Tomlinson today with us. Thank you very much, Professor Tomlinson, for accepting our invitation. It's really a pleasure to have you. I invite you now to open your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rita. Hello, everybody. It's great. I've got to say, to start with, it's great to be back in Brazil, which is a country I've been to 3 times and enjoyed every time. I just wish I was actually there. Instead, I'm in a very cold, grey, wet Southport. Probably never heard of Southport. Southport's a small seaside town in the UK. It's near the greatest city in the world, the city with the most friendly people and the best football team in the world. A football team which has 3 Brazilian players in the team. Any guesses as the city? And the city, of course, is Liverpool, a great city. I started as a student in Liverpool in 1962, a long, long time ago, when the Beatles were playing at our dances. And then I lived in 9 different countries around the world. Then I came back to Liverpool and became a professor and taught in the same classroom where I was a student in 1962. So I'm very happy now living near Liverpool, but I wish I was in Brazil. Okay, just before I start, let me just say that I will leave some time at the end for questions, but please interrupt me anytime. I'm very happy to take interruptions, people asking questions, making a point, or if you just want to shout rubbish. I'm used to people shouting rubbish because sometimes I'm quite provocative and I say things that people don't like, but interrupt. I'm very happy. Okay, so I'm gonna start then and I'm talking about developing materials for young learners. Okay, Gabrielle? Gabrielle, okay, we have the PowerPoint. Okay, right, so I'm just gonna wait for the PowerPoint to appear and then we'll get started. Let's see if the PowerPoint appears. Oops. An exciting moment as we wait to see if it will work.
I believe she's preparing to share. Yes, almost there.
Right. Okay. So as you can see, my session is called Developing Materials for Young Learners, Principles and Procedures. Okay, so let me get started. Okay, Gabrielle? Right. So I'm going to start just with mentioning some distinctive features of young learners. And by young learners, I'm talking about learners of a second language, age 3 to 12. I think after 12, the big differences occur, and some differences will occur with materials and methodology. So 3 to 12. Now, the first point I want to make is these learners, aged 3 to 12, normally have no immediate need to use English. They don't need English, and therefore no apparent need to learn it. As far as they're concerned, what's it for? Why are they learning? Why are they learning English? They don't use English in Brazil. But what's happening all over the world now is there is pressure to teach young learners because it's considered to be an advantage. If they start young, this is an advantage. In fact, there is evidence to suggest that there is no big advantage starting at 3 or starting at 12. But it's become it's a thing that parents want to do. It's a thing that politicians want to do. It's a thing that ministers want to do. It's not necessarily a thing that children want to do. So I think we need to bear that in mind. We cannot assume motivation. We cannot assume awareness of the need to learn English. Okay? Okay, Gabriel. As I've just said, their government, their parents, and their teachers might want them to learn English, but we can't assume that young learners themselves will want to learn English. And this is highly important for how we as materials developers and teachers prepare to teach young learners. Okay? Okay, Gabriel? Now, an obvious point is that each young learner is different in context, culture, language background, language learning experience, expectations, current capabilities, motivation, and crucially, access to resources. So each young learner is very different, but there are universals of young learner acquisition. And by universals, I mean that this applies to any young learner anywhere in the world of any age between 3 and 12 in any situation. And these are the universals which I think need to drive our materials, whilst at the same time considering the importance of two key words which I'll stress all the way through: localization, personalization. So I'm saying we develop materials according to universal principles, but we then ensure that these materials are sufficiently localized and personalized to appeal to the young learners. Two key words which I'll keep coming back to. Okay? Right, so I'm just going to list some things which I think young learners benefit from. Well, not just me, many researchers. I'll give some references in a minute. And this is based on my research, my experience around the world. The key thing is enjoyment. Young learners don't need English. They're not intrinsically motivated. It must be enjoyable. And the sad thing is, I've been in classrooms in over 80 countries around the world. And I've been involved in the teaching of young learners in 5 or 6 countries. And I have found most course books and most materials, even video materials, film materials, are not very enjoyable because they're focusing far too much on the language. The materials focus on the language to be taught. They should be focusing on the effect on the learner. And I'm arguing the effect should be that the learners enjoy the lesson and they enjoy learning English, and therefore they want to learn English. All the evidence says if you don't actually want to learn the language, you won't learn it, no matter how good the teachers or the materials. So getting learners to enjoy it and want to learn it is key. So that's the first thing that young learners benefit from. There we are, yeah. Right, and this is a very important point. Young learners do not need explicit teaching. We should not be teaching young learners. We should be helping young learners to learn. So young learners learn best from implicit learning through experience of language in use. Language in use, not language drills, not language practice, not language exercise, language use. Actually listening to English being used, reading English being used, using it themselves, and not worrying about getting everything right, not worrying about mistakes. This is the big mistake that teachers make, insisting on correctness from young learners at the beginning. It's ridiculous. No young learner in the world, whether first language or second language, has ever spoken the language without first of all making mistakes. We learn from the mistakes. Mistakes are important. We should give opportunities to learners to make mistakes. And that is how they learn, from attempting to understand and use the language. So that's a key point I'll keep coming back to as well. And they learn best from holistic learning. By holistic learning, I mean not focusing on discrete points, not focusing on one thing at a time. I mean, for example, listening to a story is holistic because you hear many different structures, you hear many different lexical items, you hear the reader's intonation, you are experiencing many things. Yet, implicit learning and holistic learning, if you look at most course books teach young learners, they teach young learners explicitly. Right, today we're going to do the simple past. Why? Why does the learner need the simple past? No, today we're going to listen to a story. And to focus on the simple past is ridiculous for young learners. It's completely pointless. We should be providing implicit learning through holistic learning. So you can see I've got strong views on this because I've seen young learners bored to tears all over the world. And I've seen young learners spend 6 years in primary school failing to learn English. After 6 years, they cannot say anything. And the main reason is it wasn't enjoyable. It was explicit teaching, and it wasn't holistic learning. Okay? Right. I think this is very obvious to anyone who has taught young learners, or very obvious to anyone who has children of their own. Children learn from doing things, not from studying things. So it's very important that activities are kinesthetic. They involve movement. Not children sitting in a desk studying a book, but children moving around, using their bodies, using their arms, using their face. What has come to be known as embodied language. I mean, I'm doing it now. I'm using gestures. Whenever we use language naturally, we do so not just with words, but with all sorts of paralinguistic and extralinguistic features, like facial gestures, like hand gestures, like intonation, like pause, like volume. And children need experience of that, of responding to it and of using it themselves. So we want kinesthetic activities, not studial activities. Okay? And anyone who's got children of their own know that children learn from play. So playing games, but also playing with the language. If you listen to children in the first language, they don't imitate, they create. So children create language, they play with the language, they have fun with it, they say silly things with it. And there is a theory of learning called the bizarreness theory, very serious theory about silliness. And the theory says the sillier the activity, the more memorable it is. The more bizarre the activity, the more bizarre the story, the more bizarre what people say, the more memorable it is. And children love this. They love the silliness. They love play. Many schools don't encourage silliness. They encourage seriousness. We have to study. We have to prepare for the exam. And this prevents language learning. So you can see one of the things none of these things are in most course books. So we are preventing language acquisition instead of facilitating it. Okay? Yeah, this is an interesting one. I argue that most lessons I've ever seen and most books, most course books, most courses are too easy. Young learners need to be challenged. But I'm saying achievable challenge. Obviously, if it's just too difficult, then this is diminishing the learner and it's putting the learner off. It's deterring the learner. But if it's too simple and too mechanical, like drills, then the brain of the learner is not being activated. We need to activate the brain in order to learn. If it is purely automatic, purely mechanical, without any challenge, then there is no durable. You can get ephemeral learning, instant learning, but it's not durable. We need durable learning. For durable learning, we need a challenge. The brain needs to be challenged. Okay, and I think the final point, a very important one, absence of threat. If a learner is threatened by the teacher being sarcastic, by the teacher overcorrecting, and by the school always testing, then this will deter acquisition. I personally cannot see any reason at all why we need to test young learners. What is the point? Why are we testing them? Why are we grading them? Why are we saying, you've got 70%, you're 15th in the class? And what value is that for language learning? Right? So we should stop threatening learners and start encouraging learners. So my argument there is, ideally, we should not test at all. If we have to test, then the test should be enjoyable. The test should be kinesthetic. The test should involve play. The test should involve achievable challenge. In other words, there should be no different from the typical classroom experience and the test. I'm going to talk later about a country in the Pacific called Vanuatu, where I worked in primary education, and where there was a lot of testing, and the ministry insisted on the tests. And what we did was to change it so that the test, the typical test, the grammar translation test, the filling in the blanks, we got rid of it. This was in 1981, and we introduced a task-based syllabus in 1981. So in class, the kids did enjoyable, challenging tasks involving holistic activities in which they used the language. And then in the test, they did exactly the same thing. So we removed the threat. Okay, so the next slide, please, Gabriel.
Professor Tomlinson.
Yeah.
I think we have a question.
Okay, please.
Sandra?
Well, Professor, Gabrielle is asking, should we assess learning otherwise then?
Sorry, should we assess?
Should we assess learning otherwise?
Yeah, I don't think there's any need to assess young learners at all. They don't need a certificate. You might need to assess adults to provide evidence to employers that they are proficient in the language. Learners don't need any evidence. So I'm saying we shouldn't assess them at all. But if we've got to, then we must do it in different ways from the traditional ways of testing. Because traditional testing is threatening, because what it is negative. Traditional testing says, right, to achieve 100%, you have to be absolutely, totally perfect. If you're not perfect, we penalize you. Right? And then this has a negative effect on the learner. And it has a negative effect, as someone has just said, a negative washback effect on the teaching. I'll give you another example. I'm going to also talk about Indonesia, where I worked. And we had it was a very big World Bank project, which I ran in Indonesia. And one class in every school had this experimental class, which I'll talk about a little bit later, which was very much holistic. We didn't teach discretely. We didn't teach explicitly. And we didn't prepare the kids for the exam. What we did was provide them with massive experience of the language in use. I'll give some more detail later. At the end of the year, the kids from our classes taking the traditional exam actually outperformed the kids from all the other classes massively. Not because they'd been prepared for the test, not because they'd practiced multiple choice and filling in the blanks, they didn't, but because they'd had such a rich and enjoyable experience of the language. They gained confidence, they gained motivation, and they gained marks on the exam as a result. So that is my approach. Okay.
Thanks, Professor.
Okay. Right, so to follow it on very quickly here, because I'm really saying the same thing here. So I'm saying the following have little or no benefit for young learners. And one is what I've already mentioned, explicit teaching of language. Two, Gabriella, is insistence on correctness. I've never understood this. Why we insist on people being correct? It's not possible. You can't be correct straight away. And why do we treat lack of correctness as something wrong? The student has done something wrong. And I've seen students punished for being incorrect. When I was a young kid, I learned French at school. My French teacher had the same name as me, Tomlinson. And he seemed to think that I was letting the Tomlinson tribe down whenever I made a mistake. And he had a stick. And if I made a mistake, he would hit me on the head with the stick. As a result, I was terrified of making a mistake. And when I went to France for the first time, I was too scared to speak French in case anybody hit me with a stick. It really affected me. And that's what teachers' insistence on correctness can do to learners. Okay? So explicit teaching and correctness. And the opposite in a way, repetitive exercises and drills. We're going way, way back here to the 50s and 60s when this was considered to develop habits of correctness. It doesn't. All it does is make children very bored. It has no real impact on the brain. It's a very weak signal to the brain. And the brain has a very weak record because repetitive exercises and drills are impoverished in information. They tell us nothing about context. They tell us nothing about why and when you use this structure. They tell you nothing about the reality. and there's no creativity, there's no play, there's no challenge. In my opinion, the worst thing you can do is waste time doing drills and repetitive exercises. Okay? And as I've said, frequent testing. Definitely not. Stop testing. And yeah, okay. Yeah, okay. So we'll move on. So that's my start. That's what I believe very strongly. Now, it's based on my experience, but also on research. So I've put a number of references here. So Gabriele, if you could show the references. Right, so a number of references there. At the end of the PowerPoint, I've got all the references, and you're very welcome to the PowerPoint afterwards. So they will be shared afterwards with everybody. I would particularly, sorry, we got lost them. I would particularly recommend the Bland 2015. Some excellent chapters in that, basically saying the same things I'm saying. In fact, I do have a chapter in that book myself saying what I'm saying in this presentation. So in many ways, this presentation is based on my chapter in that book. And the Read 2015 is just a very small introduction to the book, but it says it all in 2 pages. And Irma Gosen, there are 4 references to Irma Gosen. She is doing fantastic work in the Middle East with young learners by replacing the course book with children's literature, replacing the course book with storytelling, and getting dramatically beneficial results for the learners. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, so let's look at principles. I'm a great believer in principles. Now, my argument is this. Principled criteria should be developed and articulated for use in the development, evaluation, adaptation, and use of materials. And they should be the same criteria. Course books, I mean, I've written many course books myself, and I've been involved in course book projects. And typically, there are no criteria. There's a syllabus. And the big question is, how do we teach this syllabus? Now, that's the wrong question. The big question should be, how can we help learners to learn? And to do that, I'm arguing that we develop and articulate criteria. And I'm going to focus on 6 criteria in a minute, which I believe are the most important criteria. Okay? And the criteria should be driven by what we know about how young learners best acquire a new language. We know this from research and experience. I've had some interesting experiences with young learners. For example, very, very significant experience in China. I was taken to a primary school in China, and there were normally 40 children in class. When I was there were only 30. I found out later that the 10 weakest children had been told to stay at home, because when you have a visitor to a class, the school and the teacher want to impress the visitor. And what happened is the children had been rehearsed in the lesson. So they got every question right, and no one made a mistake in the entire lesson. And then at the end of the lesson, I said, can I talk to the class? And I tried to talk to the children, and of the 30 children, only 4 of them could understand anything I said. Only 4 of them could talk to me. And I asked them, how did you learn English? One of them had a fantastic interest in football, just like me. Right? And every week he had a magazine sent from England called, I've forgotten what it was called now, something soccer. It's a magazine I used to get when I was a boy in England. So it was for native speakers. So very difficult, but because he was so interested in football, he can understand a lot of it. So he picked up a lot of language incidentally from reading about his passion. And that tells you a lot, right? If children read about something they're really interested in, they will pick language up from it. Another of the boys, he went, this was in Guangzhou, and in Guangzhou there's a park, and I think it's every Friday, they invite speakers of English to go to the park and have conversations. And he went to this park every Friday and talked to people in English. So he picked up English from conversation, from experience. And the third one was a computer freak. And every night he went home and he went straight on the web and he looked for English on the web. A lot of it he couldn't understand, but he picked up. So all three of them had acquired language from experience. They weren't perfect. They weren't completely correct. They weren't completely fluent, but they could actually have a conversation with me. And they got that from experience of the language. The other kids in the class, they could repeat what the teacher taught them, but they couldn't have a conversation. And I think that tells you a lot. Okay, and similar experiences in Japan, similar experiences in Vanuatu. Interestingly, in Japan, and this was true in Indonesia as well, in the morning they had formal classes with explicit teaching, focus on discrete language points. In the afternoon, they had an English club for volunteers. In the English club, they played games, they did puzzles, they did tasks, no explicit teaching. The kids in the English club, they could use English. The kids in the formal classes couldn't. So just a few anecdotes to stress my point about young kids learn from experience of the language. Okay, so, right. And the same criteria need to be used for the development, evaluation, and adaptation of materials. I was involved in a course in Ethiopia where I insisted before we develop the materials, we develop criteria and we specify the criteria. And the same in Namibia, for young learners in Namibia. And as we developed the materials, we evaluated them against the criteria. When the materials were finished, they were evaluated and revised against the criteria. So you have the same criteria for developing materials as you have for evaluating the materials. And you keep on monitoring and you keep on revising. So I'm stressing the importance of the criteria. Okay. And I'm also suggesting that this is unusual, that the users of the materials, i.e. the teachers particularly, also need to develop criteria for evaluating, adapting, and using the materials they are given. So the criteria I'm going to talk about are not just useful for materials developers, but for teachers. So you look at your course book and you match it to the criteria. Where it doesn't match, for example, if one of the criterion is that the materials should give the learners a rich exposure to language in use, and you look at the course book and it's very, very restricted, just simple sentences, then you need to provide more experience in language. So you might tell more stories, you might give more stories to read. So the criteria help you to evaluate and adapt the course book. Okay, so let me move on now to the principles. And my first principle is this. So young learners need exposure to the language in use. So I'll stop at that point first of all, and I'll stress language in use. They don't need exposure to artificial contrived examples. They need exposure to language in use. I remember walking through the streets of Tokyo in Japan, and I walked past a school, and this kid came rushing out and he said to me, I have got a pen. I have got a pen. I have got a pen. And he just learned that in class, right? But that's not language in use, because why is he telling me this? What's the point of the communication? All he's doing is displaying what he has learned, right? And I tried to talk to him, but he couldn't talk to me at all. All he was doing was learning contrived examples. He wasn't learning to communicate. So young learners need exposure to language use. To me, this is the most important principle of all, right? And to language in use, which is rich. Now, this is controversial. Most course books for young learners are deliberately restrictive and simplified. They use the principle of the simpler, the better. So if you're learning the past perfect, let's have no distractions, nothing else. Let's focus on the past perfect. Now, to me, that is impoverished input, impoverished exposure. Yeah, because there's a simple fact, which is input, which is the language learners are exposed to, is much, much bigger than intake, which is the language learners take in for processing. So input is always bigger than intake. If input is very small, then intake will be tiny. If input is bigger, then the intake will be smaller than the input, but it will still be bigger. So the bigger the input, the better, providing it is not so dense and difficult as to put the learner off. So the learner doesn't need to understand every word. And it's also a fact that in a class of 40 learners, each learner will acquire something different. They don't all acquire the same thing. So they need a rich exposure. So rich, I'm saying rich in quantity, so a lot of it, a lot of language, and rich in quality. Rich in quality meaning it's very interesting, and meaning also it's not just narrowly focused. It includes, for example, embodied language. It includes gesture, it includes intonation, it includes volume. Not you're teaching it, you're giving them experience of it. So we need a rich input, okay? And this is also controversial. It needs to be authentic. By authentic, I mean not designed to teach language, but intended for communication. That's how children learn their first language. They don't learn their language from examples and drills. They learn their language from their peers and from their parents, and they learn from authentic use. In other words, language use for communication. So right from the beginning, before they can say a single word, what they should be listening to is authentic language, not contrived artificial language. So these first 2 points are very, very controversial, because I don't know any course book for young learners which does this, except ones I've been involved in myself. Okay. Now it should be accessible. A long time ago, Stephen Krashen, you might have heard of Krashen, talked a lot about comprehensible input. He said that what learners needed was comprehensible input. That is, well, this was interpreted as language they can understand. A lot of teachers misunderstood what he was talking about, and they thought you had to pre-teach the language of any story. Stephen Krashen went to Indonesia and gave talks to teachers. I worked in Indonesia and I saw the consequence. In the classroom, teachers in a reading lesson with young learners were pre-teaching all the vocabulary. And they spent 40 minutes pre-teaching the vocabulary, and then the bell went and the children never read the story because they had focused on the language and not the story. The students do not have to understand every word. The text, whether it's for listening or reading, needs to be accessible. That is, they can understand enough of it to enjoy it. They can understand enough of it to do an activity. So it's understanding enough which is important. That accessibility, the access to the language, allows them to acquire. If it's not accessible, obviously they're not going to acquire it. But it doesn't mean they have to understand everything. So the mistake made in most course books is too much teaching, too much simplification. Okay? Meaningful. This is a strange word, meaningful. It doesn't mean that you can understand it. By meaningful, I'm saying that the language the learners are exposed to is of relevance, of significance, of importance to the learner. It connects to the learner's life. Right? Now, that's a huge problem with many course books, because many course books, especially global course books, don't know, the writer doesn't know the learner. So how can they make the language meaningful? And too often, countries buy course books written by writers from England or America who don't know the country where the course books are being used. And often the language is not meaningful. It doesn't relate to, it doesn't connect with the learners. And I argue the best people to write course books are teachers. And the best course books are those written in the country for learners in the country. I've been involved in course books, and the best ones were written in Namibia by teachers for Namibian students. In Indonesia by Indonesian teachers for Indonesian students. Not written in England or written in America by experts in the language. Okay. And right, the next one, embodied, I've already mentioned. It's calculated that about 70% of the meaning of anything that's being said, for example, right now, is not communicated in the words, but in the voice, in the hands, in the face, in the expression, in the body language, in the eye contact, in the proximity. And this is denied to many young learners. So they need experience through videos, through films, through interaction with the teacher, through interaction with each other, of using the body to communicate as well as the words. Right, and finally, a very important one, which is recycling. It's been calculated that learners need to encounter a lexical item, a vocabulary item, at least 10 or 11 times before they acquire it. So there's no point in seeing a word 2 or 3 times. And the structure, you need hundreds of encounters. Okay. Therefore, it's very, very important. Now, most course books, most syllabuses are too big. And therefore, the course book based on the syllabus contains too many teaching points and too much language to be learned. And therefore, there's insufficient attention paid to recycling. One of my friends, Professor Mukundan in Malaysia, analyzed the Malaysian course books for young learners, and he found there was no recycling. words and structures which appeared in Unit 9 didn't appear again. So there's no chance of acquiring a language unless it is meaningfully recycled. I'm going to give you an example of something which sums up all of these, yes, all of these things in one example. So here's an example of a children's book called Mine's Bigger Than Yours. This is written for native speakers, but I use it with learners of English as an L2. And what I would do with it is, in the classroom, I would start with what I call a readiness activity. And I would simply ask learners to hold up their pen. Everybody hold up your pen. And they've all hold up a pen. But I have taken into the classroom a big pen, this big. And I would say, right, here's my pen. My pen's bigger than yours. And then I would say, have you got a book? Oh, hold up your book. And they would hold up a book. And I have taken in a book this big. So I would then say, my book's bigger than yours. And then one more example. I would say, point to your nose. So they point to their nose. And I've got a big artificial nose, which I put on, very big nose. Now, my nose is bigger than your nose. Mine's bigger than yours. And then I say, I'm going to tell you a story called Mine's Bigger Than Yours. And this is a story about a little hairy monster, little baby hairy monster, and a great big scary monster. Now, all the children, what I want you to do is to get into twos. Okay, everybody find a partner. So get into twos. Right. One of you is the little hairy monster, the little baby monster. Okay, decide who is the little baby monster. The other one is the great big scary monster. Okay, you ready? So who's the little monster in your okay, and who's the big scary monster? Okay, you ready? Now I'm going to tell you the story. As I tell you the story, I want you to do the actions. Don't worry if you don't understand everything. Don't worry if you can't do everything. Just watch other people. Okay? Are you ready? So what I'm going to do now with you at the conference, I'll just give you a sample of the story of the lesson. You get the idea. Okay, so imagine I'm beginning the story with the class. Just imagine the children doing the actions. Little hairy monster was sitting on a rock, licking a lollipop. Okay, let me see you, everybody. All the little hairy monsters, sit on the rock and lick your lollipop. So the children watch others and they do it. And along came a scary monster. I'm bigger than you, said Scary Monster. Give me your lollipop. And then the children were playing the Scary Monster. Okay, right? Everybody again. So I'm bigger than you. And they do it. Give me your lollipop. But little hairy monster wouldn't. She got up and walked off. So the little hairy monster walks off. And then it continues. Scary Monster walked after her. My feet are bigger than yours, he said. Give me your lollipop or I'll kick you. No, said little hairy monster. And she stepped out of his way. So you can see how it goes. So in every incident, the scary monster is chasing the little monster and claiming that he has got bigger feet, bigger tail, bigger legs, bigger claws. So what you're getting is a lot of recycling of structures, but in context, in what is authentic. It's not intended to teach. It's intended to tell a story. And what happens is eventually the little monster runs into a cave and hides. And the scary monster comes into the cave. Scary monster stood still and listened. My ears are bigger than yours, he said. I can hear you. Found you. Give me your lollipop. No, roared little hairy monster. My roar's bigger than yours, laughed scary monster. Give me your lollipop or I'll deafen you. No, 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 said little hairy monster. And she put her hands over her ears. And then it goes on. And the scary monster opened his great big mouth. My teeth are bigger than yours, he said. Give me a lollipop or I'll bite you. And it goes on. But eventually it gets to scary monster was very hungry. My tummy is bigger than yours, he said. Give me a lollipop right now or I'll eat you. I wouldn't do that if I were you, said little hairy monster. Why not? Asked scary monster. And she said, because. So scary monster says, I wouldn't do that. The hairy monster says, I wouldn't do that. Why not? Asked scary monster. And she said, because. And at this point, so you've got to imagine the children are running all over the room, acting this out, not understanding everything, but having great fun. So the exposure to language is rich, it's authentic, it's accessible because there's a context, it's meaningful because they're doing it, it's embodied because they're using the voice and their hands, and it's recycled. And at the end, and she said, because I asked them to sit down now in their pair and to work out what little monster is going to say when she said, because. I wouldn't do that, because. And they have to imagine it, write it down, and then act it out to another pair. So two pairs get together and they act out their ending of the story. And only then do I reveal the ending. And the ending is, if you remember, the threat was the scary monster was going to eat the little monster. I wouldn't do that if I were you. Why not? Asked scary monster. And she said, because my mum is bigger than your mum. And there's the picture of the little monster's mum is much bigger than the scary monster's. Okay, so that's just an example. Oh, and right at the end, there's a wonderful, wonderful picture. I don't know if you can see it, of the mother hugging the little baby with a tail coming out of her mouth. Okay, all right, so that's an example of what I'm talking about. And that's holistic learning. They're not learning the comparative structure, they're experiencing it in authentic use. So that is what I'm saying we should be doing. It is happening in first language education. Somehow in second language education, we seem to think we have to teach the language when we should be providing an enjoyable experience of it. Okay, so let me move on. All right, principle 1 can be applied through the use of, and I've just listed a few things here which can help you to apply this one. Extensive reading. Now, obviously, right at the beginning, the learners can't actually read in English to actually start with, but I'll just give you some examples of what some of the teachers have done. For example, I'll give you the example in Indonesia, where we were teaching complete beginners. They were actually 11-year-old, but they were complete beginners in English. And at first, we just used listening. We used something I'm going to explain later, TPR+, where they listened to stories, a bit like the one I've just done. They listened to the story and acted it out, what I call TPR+, total physical response plus. There's a story. Right? And there was no reading and no speaking and no writing. Gradually, we introduced reading. And what we did was to brainstorm all the good friends between Bahasa Indonesia, the language spoken by the children, and English. And we found hundreds of words like taxi, video, TV, hospital, had very similar words in Bahasa Indonesia. So we listed them all, and then we put them into themes, and then we wrote stories, quite long stories, 4-page stories, in which the 50% of all the content words were good friends. Right? Now, in any story, 50% of the words are structural words and not content words, so you don't need to understand them. So half of the 50% content words were good friends, and they could understand them because they were similar to words in their own language. So they started reading not 2 or 3 lines, but 4 pages. So their first experience of reading was extensive, not intensive. And that's very important. In most course books, there's a story of 3 lines long, very intensive, and the teacher focuses on the language. What we were doing is providing them with extensive experience of the language in use. It was authentic because it wasn't intended to teach those words, but to provide an interesting, exciting, funny, silly story. Another example, an example from Vanuatu. They didn't have any readers. And in fact, they didn't have any course books. An interesting question, actually. Someone asking me, did you use the first language to teach? That the answer is no. The teacher used English all the time, but the students used the first language at the beginning. So they were talking to each other in Bahasa Indonesia, but the teacher was telling the story in English, giving the instructions in English. So I'm a great believer in this. Okay, another quick example, then I better move on. In Vanuatu, I saw this lesson where the kids always lined up outside, and the teacher said to the kids, guess what? We've got a television. Whoa, what? Television? And at that time, there was no television in Vanuatu. This was in the 1980s. Come in and see. And the kids came excited into the classroom. This is important to get the kids excited. And what she'd done, she had a big cardboard box, and she cut out a screen and put knobs on it so it looked like a television. And the kids sat in a semicircle around the cardboard television. She had translated a local Vanuatu legend, a fairy story, into English. And she put it on a long piece of paper. And she got a rolling pin from her kitchen, and she put the story onto the rolling pin and rolled it up. And then she put the pin in the rolling pin in the cardboard box behind the screen. So on the screen was the title of the story in English. The kid sat in front of the cardboard box. She slowly turned the rolling pin, and the story came on the screen. And the kids were really excited. And they were talking as they read, explaining words, helping each other, laughing, joking, really enjoying the story. And she gradually turned it a little bit faster to increase the reading speed. And that was a wonderful example of extensive reading. She didn't teach anything, didn't focus on anything. She gave them this very enjoyable experience of a long story which was familiar, was connected to their lives. And there was a very, very rich exposure to language in use. So that's extensive reading, and then extensive listening is obviously, yeah, there's a question, yeah? Sandra?
Yeah. Professor, Bruno has asked, in this experience, did you use the first language to teach? And this is something which we've been discussing a lot. Yeah, what's the role of the first language in teaching and learning a foreign language?
My view is the teacher should use the foreign language because she is the main source of exposure to the language in use. In most cases, the kids in the classroom will have no exposure to language outside the classroom. So they need as much as possible inside the classroom. The teacher is there in context. She can make what she says accessible because of the context, right? Now, you can't expect young learners at the beginning to use the foreign language. It's impossible. So at the beginning, they use the L1, right? In Indonesia, we use this approach of storytelling, and they acted out the stories for 6 weeks. We covered the entire syllabus in 6 weeks, experientially, without any focus on the language. And gradually, they started to speak. And we found they were enjoying it so much that they were going home to what's called the kampong, the village. And they were gathering all the little kids, even younger than themselves, and telling them the same story and getting the kids to act it out. So they were gradually acquiring English. They were going through what's often called the silent period. And we weren't insisting, we weren't pushing. And gradually, they started to use more English. Then to me, what happened, you get code switching. So in the classroom, they were switching between English and Bahasa Indonesia. And I told the teachers, don't stop them. This is very, very useful. It's very, very important. You keep using English, encourage them to use English, but allow them to switch codes. And gradually they moved from no English to code switching, eventually to everything in English. And then that's my approach to this.
Thank you, Professor.
Okay. Right, I better move on, actually. Okay, so if we go on, extensive listening is really the same principle. Okay, so we'll go straight on. I'll go quickly through this because it's fairly obvious. Extensive viewing of films, of videos, of live performances. I'm a great believer in live performances. I get in schools, I get teachers to put their classes together. So maybe you've got 3 classes together in the hall or outside. And then the 3 teachers act out a little drama. And then the kids go back to their classrooms. So it's a live performance by teachers of some silly comedy or silly fairy story or silly science fiction story. Okay, so extensive reading, listening, viewing, an extensive performance by the students. Once they start to use some English, get the students to perform. I'm a great believer in doing impromptu plays. The kids are very good at it. They're very creative. And don't worry about correctness. And obviously, traditionally, songs, poems, rituals, these been used for many, many years in young learners' education. But a great believer in getting them to perform. Okay, right, we'll move on. I'm a bit behind time. And please, in course books, let's have extended and engaging texts. The texts in course books are too short and often not engaging because they've been designed to illustrate a language point. I don't know if I'm going to, all right, I'll tell you very briefly about my favorite approach is called the text-driven approach, which we used in Namibia. So what we used in Namibia to develop a national course book. And the idea is you don't follow the syllabus that the groups, we have 30 teachers and they divided into 10 groups. So 3 teachers in a group. Each group, I told them, forget the syllabus, go and find an engaging text. And we had got storybooks, we had got videos, we'd got plays, we'd got songs. And they started by choosing a potentially engaging text. And that text drove the unit, not the teaching point. The learning points emerged from the text. There was some attention to language eventually, but the initial attention was to the engaging text. Right? The problem in course books is they choose or write the text to illustrate a language point, so they're often not engaging. Okay? Oh, the most important thing of all, the teacher chatting to young learners. As I said, the teacher is the main source of exposure. Don't teach them, talk to them, talk with them, interact with them. Best lessons I've ever seen for young learners are the teacher just chatting. And when learners are working in groups, going around, not correcting, but chatting, getting the learners to talk back, getting them so they're not scared of talking. They know they're not going to be corrected. They know they're not going to be judged, not going to be evaluated. So it becomes natural for this learner to talk with the teacher. Okay. And nowadays, the learner use of the internet. Obviously, very, very young learners or beginners aren't going to find much on the internet, but one very, very interesting example is in Finland. In Finland, they decided, for some crazy reason, they were going to teach 3- and 4-year-olds English in classes. And they gave them sort of diagnostic tests when they put them in class. And they couldn't believe it. These kids, aged 3 and 4, could actually communicate in English in Finland, right? Where they'd never been taught any English, and they were communicating in English. And what they found was, at home, these kids watched a lot of children's programs, cartoons and children's programs in English on TV and on the web. And the important thing, these films and programs were not dubbed into Finnish. They were in the original English with subtitles. And they found this was where they were acquiring English. They were acquiring English implicitly from watching enjoyable programs in English with subtitles. They didn't need to teach them. They just carried on doing that. And some interesting examples I found, actually, to some extent, this is true in Europe between Spain and Portugal. And actually, to some extent, in South America between Brazil and Argentina. I have to admit, in Argentina, I found more programs which were in the original English with subtitles. In Brazil on TV, many of the programs seem to be dubbed into Portuguese. And that seems to make a difference. So watching kids' programs on the internet with subtitles seems to be extremely useful for acquiring language. Okay, next point. Yeah. Okay. And communicating with other young people via social media depends on the age of the kids and the control. But just using email, WhatsApp, or whatever, just chatting with people in other classes, in other countries around the world. And finally, notice all of these things involve experience, not teaching. And the last point, learn the use of English outside the classroom with fellow learners. One of my PhD students in Japan, an Englishman in Japan, formed an English, his theory, and he's correct, was there's not enough time to acquire a language in the classroom. I don't know in Brazil how many hours a week kids have, but in many countries it may be only 3 hours, 5 hours. It's not enough. Can't acquire a language in that time. What he did was form an English club, and students in all these classes, even at different levels, some of them volunteered to join his club, and they wore a badge to show membership of the club. And there was one rule: if you meet a member of the club in the corridor, in the school, in the canteen, in the playground, maybe on the bus, anywhere, you talk to each other in English. And they followed this for a year. And he pre-tested all the learners in his classes in their ability to communicate, not in their correctness, but in their ability to communicate. And then a year later, he tested them all again in their ability to communicate. Those students in the club who had been talking to each other in the corridor, in the canteen, performed far better than those who were not in the club. And the only difference was they communicated in English outside the classroom, thus adding massively to their experience of English. Right, so that's a lot on principle one. I'll have to go pretty quickly on the other principles, but that's the main principle. All right, principle two, learners need to be able to connect texts and tasks to their own lives. Pretty obvious point, particularly if you're using a global coursebook. The global coursebook often cannot connect, so we need to connect. It doesn't have to be about their normal life, but we need to make the connection. A quick example, I taught in Nigeria in West Africa, and the coursebook had a reading text on what was then called Eskimos in the Arctic, making igloos from snow. Completely irrelevant to people in Nigeria who had never seen snow. So what I did was to ask them, they all lived in villages, how do you make your houses? And they told me in the forest, trees, and we cut branches. We make houses from trees. And I said, what happens when the house is falling down? It needs repairing. And they said, well, we go to the forest, we cut more trees, we make more houses. And then I said, okay, you're going to read about people in a very cold country where there are no trees, just snow, very cold. How do you think they make their houses? And then we read the text. So they were connecting the text about the Arctic with the houses in their own villages. So it's making that connection, which is very important. Okay, so how can this be achieved? So if we go on to connections can be achieved through topic familiarity. There's a lot of research evidence on this. If you are really familiar with a topic, you can understand text written in it, which other people can't. I gave you the example of the boy in China who was very familiar with the topic of football. He could understand text written for native speakers as a primary student. Same with me. I'm fanatically interested in football. Any country I go to, I can read a newspaper about a football match and I can understand it in any language. Not all the words, but I can understand the score, who scored, was it a good game? So it's very, very important. Now, not every student will have the same topic familiarity. So here, choice becomes very important. Letting students choose their own topics to focus on. Letting students choose their own story to read, their own book to read. And that's the value of an extensive reading library where they can choose their own. Again, very quickly, in Indonesia, I was getting my teachers on a course to do this. And they said, we have no books, we have no money. All right, I've got an idea, she said. And I went to watch her lesson. The teacher came into class with a big cardboard box, put it on the table. Come on, look, our library. And all the kids rushed out. And they said, no books, empty. And she said, yeah, but this is our library. For homework tonight, find something interesting in English and bring it, put it in the box tomorrow. And the kids did this. So some of these were quite old. So these were 11-year-olds, 10 or 11. They actually, some of them went to a telephone directory and found the addresses of English speakers in Jakarta and went to the houses. Excuse me, do you have anything interesting in English? And they did. They got comics, magazines, stories. And after 10 weeks, they had 400 texts in the box. And each week, they chose one to take home and read, and then brought that one back and another one. So it didn't cost anything. And they massively increased their exposure to English. Right, so topic familiarity. Next point is localization. In China recently, in Shanghai, I saw a teacher who would put her course book, which was a global course book about America, onto PowerPoint, and she'd changed the photographs. So instead of being photographs of New York, they were photographs of Shanghai. Instead of being photographs of American people, they were photographs of teachers in the school and students in the class. So that was a wonderful example of localization. It's exactly the same course book, didn't change the course book, just changed the photos. And personalization, where an obvious one here is if there are photos in a book and you're supposed to talk about a family, you tell the students to bring photos of their own family. And then they do the same activity with photos of their family, not the photos of foreign people in the book. So they're very simple things you can do to localize and personalize. One of my, I examined a PhD recently, a student from Vietnam, who had localized an American course book by changing the American foods in the course book into Vietnamese foods, and changed American films into Vietnamese films and kept everything the same. So very easy. Okay. Visualization, getting children to visualize their own experience. A poem about first day at school, a boy's first day at school in England. I got the class to first of all see pictures in their mind of their own first day at school in their country. So you're starting, the idea is to start with the learner's experience and then go to the text. So they take that visual image of their own experience to the text, and they compare the two images created. Right, and okay, and storytelling, obviously very, very important. And I particularly recommend Bland 2015, which is in the references. And then a point I've already made, which choice. Give learners choice. Sometimes there was a poem about an old lady, very simple poem. I'm an old, old lady. I don't have long to live. Very, very moving poem. And then I wrote on pieces of cardboard 8 different activities and put them on the wall around the room. First one was paint a picture of the poem. Very simple one. Second one was, you're the old lady, write a letter to your son in Australia. And they walked around and they chose the activity they wanted to do. So they chose at their level and their level of language and interest. Okay, and then the final one is, comparisons, getting them to compare what they read about another country with what happens in their country. what they read about another city in their country with their own city or village or town. Right, let me move on to principle 3. To some extent, I've covered this already. I keep using the word engagement. I'm stressing learners need to be affectively engaged by their materials. And I'm making a very strong statement. Without affective engagements, there's no chance of effective and durable acquisition. It's the number one prerequisite, affective engagement. By affective engagement, I mean involving the emotions. So laughter, sympathy, pity, fear even, apprehension, excitement. Right? These are vital to learning. We only learn what we need and want to learn. Okay? And involving the emotions is a very, very powerful way of helping learners to acquire language. There's a lot of evidence, particularly the THOMLINSON-Nassahara 2021. But there's a lot of, we refer to the evidence. Okay, so let me go on quickly then to, so effective engagement involves the learners responding to texts and activities with their emotions. As I said, for example, laughing, getting excited, feeling happy, sympathy, apprehensive. And there's a couple of references there. There are many, many references in the literature. Very important for all learners, especially though for young learners. Being positive about the learning experience, this is vital. The learners need to enjoy and be positive about their experience. So positive about the teacher, about the materials, about the fellow learners, about the classroom, about the school. I went to a school in Mallorca in Spain where they called it an aesthetic school. It was beautifully designed and painted. And Indonesia, we had no money, but we replicated this. The headmaster got the kids to decorate and make attractive the school environment and the classroom. And they brought plants in, they brought flowers in, they brought paintings in. So the classroom was a beautiful environment. And the third aspect of affect is increasing confidence and self-esteem, taking away threat, giving them achievable challenges. So these are the 3 key elements of affective engagement, and they're absolutely vital for language acquisition. Okay. Right, so you can do this. I'll go through this very quickly because these are just some examples. Effective engagement through jokes. I use a lot of jokes, particularly at the beginning of the class. Cartoons, songs, stories, all the things I've mentioned already. Picture books, especially poems. I love poems. Which kids love poems, especially silly poems, and drama. Right? All these things are key sources. And as I said, I use a lot of books for young learners. I'll have to do this very, very quickly. No, I probably don't have time, unfortunately. No. Just an example here. There's a wonderful story called The Bumble Bear, which is about a young bear who loves honey. And he tries to take honey from a bee's hive, but gets stung. So he decides he will pretend to be a bee, and he joins the bee school. And it's this wonderful story about, sorry, I haven't got time to do it, unfortunately. But it's a bit like the one I did before about the Man's Bigger Than Yours. It's a great story in which the students can act it out. They can have fun with it, but there's a very rich exposure to authentic language. So I'm strongly advocating stories for L1 children being used with learners. Right, I better move on because I'm running out of time. Okay, I'll just go through this very quickly. So games, tasks, attitude, these are right, okay. And if we go to the last one, the TPR Plus I've mentioned, which are basically getting students to respond physically. TPR Plus means total physical response. And we did this, as I said, in Indonesia. Well, a very quick example. Story. I tell the kids, today we're going to the beach. Yeah. Shall we go to the beach or shall we have a grammar lesson? Beach. Okay, let's go to the beach. So I pretend they're on the bus going to the beach. They all get off and they go on the beach. And I tell them to sit down and relax and enjoy themselves. Then I tell them a story about the beach. And they just act it out. I'll just give you a quick example. Many people were on the beach enjoying themselves. Enjoy yourself. So they do things on the beach and having fun, playing games. Some were playing football. So the kids play football. Some were playing volleyball. So the kids play volleyball. Some were swimming. So the kids swim. And we go on. Suddenly, there was a strange noise from the sea, a strange humming noise. And he got louder and louder and louder. And then he stopped. And a strange ship appeared. Standing on the strange ship were 4 very strange creatures. And I've got 4 very confident kids to stand at the back. And they suddenly appear standing in a circle. The children on the beach were very scared and they pretend to be scared. They tried to run away. They try and run away. So the story goes on, and it's a silly story, but quite frightening. So engaging affect, engaging emotions. And the strange creatures take 2 prisoners from the beach into their circle and back to the ship. And the kids have great fun running away and pretending to be scared. And then afterwards, I get them to repeat the story. There were a lot of people on there and they shout out the beach. They were having fun. It's amazing how much language they remember. And then they sit in a group of 4 and they came from the sea part 2. They continue the story. So this was how we used TPR Plus in Indonesia. So I'm a strong advocate of this for affective engagement. Right, so there's 3 more principles and I've got 3 more minutes. So I'll just have to very briefly mention them. And then I'll do 1 more example and then finish. Okay, so principle 4, materials need to engage learners cognitively to make them think. So I'm saying affectively to make them feel, cognitively to make them think. Okay, and cognitive engagement can be achieved through problem solving. Where do fish keep their money? Where do fish keep their money? It's a very silly problem. And the kids came up with all sorts of creative answers. And jokes, obviously, get them to think about the joke. And puzzles and riddles. And inviting personal responses to listening and reading text, which entertain while raising issues. Okay. And then just on the next slide, very important, think questions, getting the kids to think, open-ended activities. There's no right answer. Deductive activities, getting them to work out. So the best way to achieve it is push them to think within their areas of interest, curiosity, and experience. Very quick example, just to finish off here. A wonderful story called Not Now, Bernard. I've just summarized it. It's about a young boy who's just come home from school. It's called Bernard. And he goes to his mum and he says, "Hello, Mum." And the mother says, "Not now, Bernard." Goes to his dad. "Hello, Dad." "Not now, Bernard." So he goes in the garden and there's a monster in the garden, big monster. And he runs into his mother. Mum, there's a monster in the garden." "Not now, Bernard." Dad, there's a monster in the garden. Not now, Bernard. And he goes back into the garden, and the monster eats Bernard, eats him up. And then the monster comes into the house, and the monster pulls the clothes of, not now, Bernard. And so the mother thinks the monster is Bernard, and the monster bites the father. Not now, Bernard. And the mother gets angry. And the mother says, right, I've made your dinner, eat your dinner. And the monster eats Bernard's dinner. Right, now go to bed. And the monster goes to bed with the milk and the comic. And the monster is treated as though he's Bernard. They don't notice that Bernard's not there. And then at the end, the monster says, oh yeah, and the monster even tries to scare the parents, and the monster goes behind the father and the father just says, "Oh, now, Bernard." But right at the end of the story, the monster says, "But I'm a monster," and the mother says, "Oh, now, Bernard." And what I did with this was to get the kids to visualize the story as they listen to it. But then instead of giving them comprehension questions, this relates to the think questions, open-ended questions. The question was a simple one. Who was responsible for Bernard's death? Whose fault was it? Who was to blame? Why did Bernard die? Wow, big question. And this was in Oman in the Middle East. And one of the male students said, the mother. The mother looks after the children. And one of the female students said, no, father. Mother was busy. What? And they had this wonderful argument in English. And to me, that's the main objective of any lesson, to get the kids to argue in English, because then they're thinking. They're arguing about their ideas, their opinions, their views. They're not just filling in a blank. And this went on for 40 minutes. That's the teacher. What? How's it the teacher? And everybody was joining in a very big class. So that's just an example of engaging, entertaining, and then provoking into thinking. Right, and very finally, number 5. Young learners can benefit from meaning-related attention to form. So far, I haven't talked about language at all. But I do believe that learners can gain from paying attention to form, not by explicit teaching, but by you providing them with an enjoyable experience of the language, then getting them to go back and focus on a particular form and make discoveries about it. A quick example. I asked children to draw a wall. So they drew a wall, and then draw the wall. Very interestingly, without thinking about it, a wall was a sort of very ordinary wall in the middle of the paper. The wall was at the front of the paper and much bigger. So they had instinctively appreciated the difference between and the. And then we looked at a story and looked at the use of and the. So again, it's getting the kids to discover rather than telling them, rather than informing them. Right, and I'll have to just jump on to the last one, which is a very obvious one. When they're ready, sorry, Gabrielle, I've jumped on to principle 6, so if you could just jump through, because I haven't got time to, you can read all this later. Yeah, when they're ready, young learners need to be provided with a variety of opportunities to use the target language for communication, not for practice, not for display, not for tests, but for communication. So I've talked a lot about that already, but there is one key reference, which is about the value of learner-learner communication. So the reference is Sato and Ballinger, 2016. You'll see it on the slide when you get the slides. Sato and Ballinger. They've done a lot of research on the value of getting learners to talk to each other. What they found was learners talking to teachers, learners played safe. They didn't want to make mistakes. Learners talking to native speakers were frightened by the native speaker. Learners talking to each other when there was no threat, no test, just a joint project or a joint activity or a fun activity, they took risks, they played with the language, and they helped each other, they explained things to each other. So they there's great value in peer-to-peer interaction. But if you can read this later, but I'm really saying at the beginning they need to be exposed to lots of language in use, and when they're ready, they need to be given lots of opportunities to use the language. Okay, and then very finally, my conclusion. This is on the next slide. My conclusion is this. So I like to end by stressing that, in my opinion, materials for young learners should aim primarily to provide an engaging and enjoyable experience of the L2. That's my main point. Should not aim primarily to instruct, but to engage and entertain. Should not provide contrived examples, but should expose the learners to the L2 in use. Should not provide control practice, but should provide opportunities for use. Should not be closed, but should be open. Open-ended questions where there's no correct answer. And finally, should be fun. Okay, and there are two follow-up readings on the next slide. An article by me in the 2015 and a chapter in 2010, Tomlinson and Masahara, where we wrote on developing materials for young learners. So a lot of the things I've been saying are elaborated on and exemplified in that article and that chapter. Right, and then you've got all the references, which I won't go through, but they're there for you to look at and follow up. Right, so I've gone over time a little bit, but I'm still happy to take questions. I don't know if you have time or not.
Fernanda, you have a question. You can open your microphone, please.
Sure. Hi, Professor.
Hi.
Great to have you here with us. Thank you very much for your presentation. Well, Rita is my supervisor, and I've been doing my PhD on tasks on TBLT, okay? And I have developed a course book to be applied in a 3-month English course.
Right.
And most tasks are open-ended.
Good, excellent.
And I would like to know the best way to assess their language acquisition. I mean, if you have, if you could help me with like what kinds of pre-tasks and post-tasks would be the best for me to assess their language acquisition. Okay.
So the main thing you're obviously testing is their ability to communicate and their ability to achieve an objective. It's not just the ability to communicate meaning, it's the ability to achieve the desired effect. So what you need to do is you give a task, an activity in which there is an objective. So the objective might be, for example, to persuade somebody to do something. Okay.
I have one like that. I have one.
Right. So,
persuade a friend.
And your assessment is on the quality of the persuasive argument. How likely is this to persuade the person? That's the main thing you're assessing. So you resist the temptation to assess the structures and the vocabulary. Obviously, if it's spoken, then fluency would be a factor, because somebody who is very hesitant isn't going to be very persuasive. And obviously, if there are far too many errors which affect comprehension, this would be a factor as well. So it's something you would assess. You wouldn't actually assess the individual errors, but the actual density of the areas preventing comprehension would be a criterion. But the main criterion is how likely is this to be effective. And when I've done this, the key thing is you can't give sort of 62 marks or 63 marks, but you can use broad bands. So basically, very likely to persuade the other person is one band, and then probably will persuade the other person, and then might persuade the other person, unlikely to persuade, and no chance of persuading. So maybe 5 bands. And I've found by getting different raters, you can get a lot of agreement on this by having just by specifying very specific criteria and then giving bands rather than marks. We did this on national exams in Zambia, where I worked in Zambia. We had hundreds, thousands to mark, and we sat in pairs, and one person would mark in a band, and then they would place that in a particular spot for that band, and the other person would read it to see if they agreed. If we disagreed, we called in an adjudicator, and we found very, very, very high rate of agreement between the raters. But you have to have specific criteria. I did this in Japan, where we had a task-based approach in class, and the same for the assessment. And for the assessment, we had criteria. And I actually got students to assess their own work. I got students to assess students by giving them the criteria, teaching them how to do it. And they were remarkably accurate in their assessment. So you seem to have got the idea already. You seem to be doing it. So that's great. Yeah, I'd be very interested in seeing that. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, and next year I'll be going to London to UCL. Okay. So I would like to know if I could meet you somehow. Like,
well, it might be possible. Yeah. You can certainly email me and see if it's possible.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we can discuss some ideas. Thank you very much, Professor.
Okay. Yeah. I look forward to meeting.
Okay. Any more questions? Very quickly. Is it okay? Professor Tomlinson, while we are waiting for any other question, I'd like to thank you a lot for this morning. I'm sure we are not going to be the same anymore after listening to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
It was very good, and we are very glad to listen to you and note that we are very aligned to what you've said here. Yesterday, we had some activities here in our event, and they matched a lot with Good. Most of the things you have said Excellent. Here. And it's a relief to us to know that maybe we are at the right path. It was very good to listen from you.
Yeah, I think you are. And certainly my experience of Brazil is that there's difficult to express this. There's an enjoyment of life, and it's communicated in the way people interact. And in classrooms I've been to in Brazil, that enjoyable interaction also takes place, and that's so important. There are many other countries where schools are very serious and very sober and very strict, and it's uncomfortable to visit the school. So I'm sure that what you're doing is basically the right thing.
We are trying. We have many challenges. Maybe not only us, but yes, we do have many challenges and many difficulties, but we are trying, and I really believe that opportunities like this one are very important to help us with
Good.
these challenges. We need more of these opportunities because
Great.
they are very important to help us to go ahead.
Well, I'm very pleased to have helped in any way, particularly in reassuring you you're doing the right thing.
It's very important.
And keep at it. It's not easy, as you say, because often parents don't understand, often administrators don't understand, often government officials don't understand, because they think you've got to teach the language. And what they're saying seems logical, but in reality, it's not. In reality, it's the experience rather than the teaching that matters. It's difficult for a teacher to stop being a teacher. I find it difficult because very often with this sort of approach, the teacher's not doing anything. It's the kids who are doing it. And you're just there. And many teachers feel, I'm supposed to be a teacher. I'm supposed to be doing something. And they feel a bit guilty. But to me, that is when the teacher has succeeded if the kids don't need the teacher. Or they only need the teacher for support, encouragement, and advice. But what the teacher has done is all the hard work before in selecting the right text, in selecting the right activities, in establishing the right mood, and in energizing the learners. To do with it, a lot of it's to do with the teacher's personality and the teacher's and learners feeling comfortable with the teacher.
Changing is not easy.
No.
But we must persist. We must believe.
Yeah, I've spent 60 years trying to change the world, but maybe a few little things have changed, but it's a battle.
Well, thank you very much. I believe that we can finish by now. Thank you very much. We hope we can have more opportunities with you in the future.
Yeah.
I would like to thank everyone here to be here with us in this morning. It was very rich. It's very good. I would like to invite everyone to the next activity that is going to start soon. Thank you very much, Professor Brian Tomlinson. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for your organization, and thank you for being so pleasant and friendly.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gabriella, as well, for saving me, basically, with the PowerPoint. You were wonderful.
It was my honor, Professor. Thank you. It was amazing. I can't stop thinking about the book you didn't read. I would like to hear.
Yeah, The Bumble Bear. That's great. I recommend it. But go into a bookshop and look at books written for English kids. And some of them are wonderful because they're not teaching, but they do expose to a rich variety of language in an engaging way.
Yeah, actually, teacher Juliana Tonelli and I, we have been talking about storytelling and the use of stories in language teaching for young learners, and it was amazing watching you telling the stories. It was astonishing. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and that's where I believe very strongly the teacher should tell the stories, not a tape, not a recording, because the teacher can dramatize the story and the teacher is much closer to the students.
That's what
was very inspiring.
So it should be part of teacher training, giving teachers the confidence and experience of telling stories, reading stories, dramatizing stories.
True. Totally true.
Yeah, but believe it or not, I used to be very, very shy when I started teaching.
I can't imagine that.
I was scared to stand up, but I realized very quickly, no, you've got to do something about this. You've got to overcome this. You've got to become a performer. I'm a great believer in teacher performance.
It was
Now I enjoy it.
incredible. The suspense you created in the end. What is what the little monster is gonna say? What is gonna happen? And I was here, please tell. And you kept stalling all the way.
Yeah.
We have a storytelling course that we
Okay.
teach. We teach teachers how to tell stories.
Good. Excellent.
Yeah, and I have learned a lot today.
Okay. I think somebody wants to ask a question. Is it Elaine?
Yes, Elaine, please.
It's me. Thank you very much, Professor Tomlinson, for everything you have just told us. And we surely learned a lot. And I would like to ask you a question. I was listening to the stories you told about the hairy monster and the angry monster, that ate the little boy and everything. And I was amazed. They were great. And I would like to ask you if for students of year 5 in primary school,
Yeah.
what would you think of using the Selfish Giant from Oscar Wilde as a theme,
Yeah.
right? For teaching a didactic unit like caring and sharing build a better place. Do you think it's too heavy? Do you think the stories must be simpler?
No, I think in that case, what you would do is tell a version of the story. So sometimes instead of reading the original, I will tell rather than read, tell a version of the story, which would be a sort of intuitive simplification. But I wouldn't deliberately simplify the language. I would just retell the story.
Right.
So it's best in that case if the teacher doesn't actually, the teacher reads the story and gets to know the story, but then takes the book away and then tells the story.
And not showing them the whole text.
No.
Oh, thank you
It
very much.
depends on the level of the learners and depends on the complexity of the text.
Yeah, because of the pandemic, we had a very big problem with the students because they don't have the level they are supposed to have because they have been having remote classes for a long time.
Yeah.
So the year 5 is not reading that much.
There is another way, which I'll very quickly tell you. It's what I call
Sorry for the
no,
question.
it's a good question. What I call a task-free activity. Task-free activity, which I do at the beginning of every lesson, and all my teachers all over the world do this. First 5 minutes is to tell a joke or tell a story or read an extract from a play or even read an extract from a magazine, which you think will engage the learners. Okay? That's all you do, but you tell it in a dramatic, interesting way.
Mm-hmm.
And then you leave a couple of minutes of silence while they absorb it. Then you remind them, and this is the important thing, that at the end of the lesson, if they were interested, they can take a written copy of the joke or the story, right? And they put it in a file, and they keep a loose leaf file of the text which have engaged them. And every so often they go back and reread it. And each time they reread it, they understand more. And sometimes they will ask me questions in class 2 or 3 days later. There was a poem about a refugee child, and it talked about his rust-colored hair. Rust-colored hair. And they looked up the word rust in the dictionary, and then they couldn't understand, why is his hair that color? And then I got them to go back to the poem and think, why? Is there any reason why it might be that color? And they worked it out, that in fact there was a lot of dust on the road and the dust was in the hair. So I don't ask them any questions. That's why it's task-free. But They reread and come back and ask me. We don't have to. There's no compulsion to do anything. But over the year, they are getting massive extra exposure to engaging text, both listening and reading and recycling. And they build up this library of these interesting texts. Very simple idea. And a German teacher did it with her German classes. And she said the kids at the end of the year, what was the most interesting part of the lesson? Oh, the stories and poems at the beginning. What was the most useful? Stories and poems at the beginning. Very popular. Because there's no threat, there's no testing, there's no questions. They just have to listen. Normally, when kids listen or read, they're frightened of the questions which are coming.
Yeah.
And if they don't understand a word, they get scared by it. And they blame themselves because they don't understand. So it's a negative experience. In this activity, it doesn't matter if they don't understand.
Yeah.
And it's quite liberating for the children.
Oh, that's great. Oh, thank you very much, because I'm using, in fact, this story
Right.
and to work like social emotional abilities,
Okay.
like empathy and this and that. And I'm having, some problems with the content of the text. And you have just given many, many ideas to work with it.
Okay,
And I would like to thank you very much.
let me know how it goes.
If I have permission, I would like to send you the didactic unit.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. It's good question.
Well, unfortunately, I'm afraid we are out of time now. We have to go to the next activity. So we could stay all day long here talking to Professor Tomlinson.
Yes.
But unfortunately, we have to finish now.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Professor Tomlinson.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
And then
we can have more opportunities in the future.
Hope so. So enjoy the rest of the conference and hope to meet you all again.
Thank you
very much.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very
It was
much.
a pleasure meeting you. Goodbye.
Okay. Bye.
Goodbye.
And an honor. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.